Well, welcome everybody to the first leadership series for 2023, focused on leading and collaboration and partnership in mind. My name is Diane Crilly. I'm Director of MA Programs at the Water Environment Federation. This topic today falls into the new strategic plan core values featured on collaborating for collective impact. Today, we have WEF President-elect Amy Killeen with us to provide the opening and closing messages. We will hear from 3 member associations sharing their journey on events partnered with other MAs, from a virtual paid format to in-person paid events. Each MA presentation also touches on other areas of the new WEF strategic plan, such as engagement, advocacy, and workforce development. Today, we will also have an opportunity to build breakout time to further our discussions on ways how we are collaborating and partnering with others. And we have WEF Counsel Barbara Dunn with us to share tips on what should clearly be stated when entering into an MOU or partnership. The leadership series is sponsored by Craig Kelman and Associates. WEF appreciates the continued support from Kelman to leadership events offered by WEF for member association leaders. At this time, I would like to introduce WEF President-elect Amy Killeen.
Hey guys, can everybody hear me and see my screen? We're all good? Okay, Awesome. So today we're going to talk about, just real quick, I have a couple slides to go over with you guys, the partnering. We visit as board members a lot of MAs, and some MAs do a lot of great partnering and some don't. It just kind of depends on the other associations in your state, right? In your member association area, and just the ability, and the syncing up with what they do. So again, goal 1 of the new strategic plan, I'm sure by now y'all have all seen this, is to attract and develop a diverse and passionate water workforce. And in order to do that, we have to do that by cultivating strategic partnerships, right? There's so much of the workforce, struggles within the workforce that are not within our wheelhouse, that we need to have partners to help us overcome. So there's a lot of different types of partnerships, right? So I just want to hit on this real quick because I have to remind myself of this quite a bit too, right? So you have like transactional partnerships, which is just like somebody you have a contract with, your vendors at Prince Provo Materials, right? They're not a strategic partner. They're probably not even a partner. They're just a contractor who does work for you. Then you have people, vendors, some people that you have a relationship with, right? You meet needs, they fill agreements for you. Maybe they sponsor something because, you give them your business. Those decisions are to have a relationship with somebody are typically based on risk and agility, not necessarily just cost, but a lot of times cost as well. This could be like a tech partner that provides some software to our member associations, right? They're providing you a service other than, being able to list you as a user of their software or the website. They don't get much out of providing you that service. Then you have like partnerships, right? And these are longer term relationships that you may have with organizations, contractors, whoever it may be. And you tend to customize your products and services to meet each other's needs a lot of times, and you provide some added value to each other. So I would say, in Kelman's case, they publish a lot of our newsletters. They're a great partnership. I would say in some MAs, depending upon what they do, they're probably strategic partners. How much depends upon the service they provide, because they do a lot of different things. But again, those decisions to have partnerships are based on access and resources, and not just on cost. Then you have strategic partnerships, which is a very high degree of collaboration between the 2 people entering into a MOU, a contract, whatever it may be. You actually create value for each other and provide like mutual gain, right? So, you're sharing staff are working together, volunteers are working together, you have a similar DNA, and things you do together because it's mutually beneficial for both of you. So example here, like NACWA, the Water Research Foundation, some of the regional biosolids associations, we do stuff together because it benefits both of us, right? And we share staff. So again, I think it's good to, in my mind, I have to think through, what are the different types of partnerships and just contractual arrangements, MOUs that we may have with people that we work with. Get you, right? There's so many things that having strategic partnership get you, and you can read all the stuff that's on the side. But I really like this graphic, right? Because it's like you have to angle two things really. Both sides are working to hold up that one thing to achieve that common goal that adds value to both people. And without that one thing, neither side could be held up, or neither side's really working on it. So again, you reach new markets, you have thought leadership from both partners that help you reach those new markets or those new audiences. It's increased brand exposure for both sides in a much larger platform to get your messaging out. So again, it's beneficial, mutually beneficial to both parties. And one thing that I know we struggle with as an organization sometimes is cultivating strategic partnerships. These are the people we typically think about when we as a water organization are like, who are we going to partner with, right? Water for People, IWA, Water Research Foundation. Absolutely. Those are great partnerships to have. But if you're trying to solve workforce challenges, I would be calling the Society for Human Resources managers, right? Because they actually hire people, right? We need to cultivate strategic partnerships if we're going to achieve our strategic plan, especially overcoming some of the workforce challenges with people who are really good at workforce issues. I like to think about it. We're doing a lot of the training materials and the background and helping change regulations to get that workforce in. But there's a lot of larger challenges to our workforce, like transportation, daycare, English as a second language. So those are other things that maybe some of these other non-traditional partners that I just threw up on the screen, certainly not all of them are all inclusive by any means. But again, we need to start thinking outside of that normal partnership box that we kind of paint ourselves in with other water sector partners and say, hey, look, the World Bank is the one giving out a lot of money. They have tons of information on water on their website. Like they're producing all kinds of great decentralized materials. So maybe we should be partnering with them for the betterment of all of our facilities, right? So again, just, kind of thinking outside that normal box. Moved my cursor, sorry. So these are just some of the questions to ask yourself. And I know WEF actually has we have like a little box, good, bad, whatever. That's great. And I know a lot of people use those when they go to say, hey, is this partnership good? Is it beneficial? And you put people in the quadrants, but just some common things to ask yourself when you're looking at partnerships is, what is our common goal with this partnership? Do we have metrics that we've outlined? What do each of us expect to gain? Do we agree? Do we align with each other just in general with vision, mission? Will it impact our brand, right? I mean, there could be companies out there, you can go partnership with TikTok, but TikTok may not have the same values that you have, right? They're a little bit different. Who will do it? How do we measure success? And are we both committed to success? And always ask yourselves what's in it for the other party, right? And then if the people who are developing this partnership leave, what will happen to the partnership, right? Again, I think that's a big one because you don't want to lose traction. You want to make sure that everybody's bought into it, including staff and volunteers. So if those people do leave, that you still have the traction to keep going. So I think that's all I have. But again, I want to make sure that from a WEF perspective, we see partnerships for sure as just one of the ways we're going to have to move in those non-traditional partnerships in order to achieve the strategic plan that the board rolled out last year. So I will turn it back over to Diane.
Well, thank you, Amy.
The next speaker.
A lot of good information that you provided there, and I want everybody to think about especially that last slide as we go into our breakout sessions later on. We'll give you those questions at that time, but your information really is setting the seed for that discussion. Thank you. So now we're going to enter into the meat of this topic today that we're talking about. And so at this point in time, I would like to introduce Executive Directors David Bays from South Carolina and Pam Burnett from the Georgia AWP Associations, who are going to share on things that they have been doing. A lot of it is part of the water advocacy with the water policy, why they started this particular collaboration, and then how they're going to pivot. So take it away, David and Pam.
Okay, Pam, just jump in anytime. I can start. The partnership that I guess we're going to highlight today, although Pam and I talk, all the time and try to make sure we're coordinated, being neighbor states and all, but is the Confluence Conference. And this started, I think, in 2003, right? Pam was the first.
Well, we started with the Tri-State Conference,
Right.
actually years before that, but we named it, I don't know when we renamed it Confluence, but yeah, it's been around a long time.
Yeah, it's in the logo, it's 2003. So I think that's when that brand was born.
Yeah.
And it's a conference that's really born out of water resource lawsuits, quite frankly. Georgia and Florida had multiple lawsuits going on. Somewhere in there, South Carolina sued North Carolina over water rights, and actually was going to be in the original jurisdiction of the U.S. Supreme Court, which if you ever want to get a lawyer excited, just tell them original jurisdiction and they'll get very excited. It's a big thing for them. And so I think that the genesis was really, it's better to talk about these water resource issues and common issues that we have in our states than it is to continue to sue each other. And so Confluence, just like the metaphor it is, I guess, for the three states, North Carolina, Georgia, and South Carolina being a confluence of ideas. Pam, you got?
Yeah, I was thinking about one of the things that we noticed is that the conflict really exists at a level above the people actually working on water resources problems. And that was so interesting to me to find that really there was no conflict at the levels where I was working or David was working. We knew that the real conflict was political, not really technical. And so this was a way for us to keep the relationships and those working, those were really working to solve problems in conversation. Even if it was just once a year, what it does is it really builds relationships that anytime you want to, you can pick up the phone and you have that relationship across the state lines. So that's really what we were fostering. We knew we couldn't solve the political issues, but we knew we could continue to work together and solve and share ideas among the three states.
Yeah, and this conference has always had a different vibe to it, I'd say. It's always been a more loose conference, a little bit more creative conference, definitely not stuffy. And everybody's very free to ask questions and to participate. For example, one of the sessions that's been at each of the conferences, it's been called Morning Mojo or some different nicknames, but I used to sit on this panel when I was in my regulatory role, but you'd have a representative from EPA and then all three states regulatory agencies to ask, sort of present what's going on in their world and then be able to ask questions. So, where else are you able to go to a conference and ask three neighboring states, regulatory representatives and EPA, what's going on and sort of get, those answers. It also allowed us to compare how different each state was. I can remember on certain issues, maybe relating back to aquifer storage and recovery. South Carolina was very progressive in allowing ASR. Georgia had prohibited ASR at one point legally, and North Carolina was, sort of studying it. And sort of it was interesting to juxtapose those, different positions really in states that are right there, together.
Absolutely that. And also the regulators that sat on those chairs felt they were in a hot seat because the audience had microphones passing around, and the vibe that David's talking about really is this is a different kind of conference. It's conversational, and you can ask anything you want to, with a tone of respect and decency, but you can ask anything that you want to, including provocative questions. And that happened a lot. But there's always a tone of humor that weaves through almost everything that's done in the Confluence Conference. Even if it's a serious subject, there's a tone of humor and just an enjoyment of, that's why I think people really do come to the Confluence Conference year after year, is you walk away not only with new relationships and restored relationships, but you feel really refreshed from a very enjoyable event.
Yeah, and it certainly has not been without its mishaps over the years, and I guess we ought to talk about those. I know MOUs are sort of one of the topics today, and the difficulty that we had, and we've now solved it. We actually have a new MOU in place, but our states association. So now I'm working, on the other side for the state association, and no longer in my regulatory role, and so I get to see the conference a little bit, through a different lens. But the MOU had to reflect what we thought at the time was a good partnership, but there are things like sponsorships that are different. So South Carolina does sponsorships on an event by event basis, and both North Carolina and Georgia have an annual sponsorship program. So that became a bit of a difficult point. How do you share sponsorships when in Georgia and North Carolina, they've already sort of prepaid for them, and that became an issue. We had North Carolina drop out for a period of time. They had a few things going on, and they dropped out of the partnership for a little while, but are now back in. What else was an adventure, Pam?
I think, the process for our planning is that we rotate the responsibility for the leadership of the conference. So, depending on who's in charge this year, in fact, Confluence happens next week in Greenville, South Carolina, but this year, so South Carolina is taking the lead. When we've taken the lead in Georgia before, we've had great participation from our volunteers, but when it moves to another state, I have a really hard time getting our volunteers to participate, and I think they're really missing the boat. So I'm actually just expressing my challenge. David doesn't really have that same challenge, but I have really found it hard to get volunteers to go, and so then a lot of it falls on me, and I don't do a great job, because I'm doing 90 other things. But that's been a little bit of a challenge, I think, partly because they don't have the history of why the Confluence Conference exists and what the value is. They weren't actively involved in all of these interstate conflicts. So it just feels sometimes like it's just another conference until you actually get there or get in, be part of the planning team.
And I actually ran into that last year. So North Carolina hosted last year. It was in Asheville, which of course is a great destination, albeit an expensive one. But when I first started engaging with the North Carolina Planning Committee, they, in essence, were planning what I would call a normal conference, you know, the typical topics and everything. And I had to pull out my grumpy old man card and go, you're not doing it right. This is not right. Let me explain to you what this conference is about and the genesis of the conference, and sort of had to get them, you know, back on track. And after a while, they got it. Okay, well, this is a conference focused on interstate water resource issues. And, you know, now that we have that, we can, you know, go forward and plan a more traditional confluence type event.
Yeah, that was interesting. That both David and I were kind of on the side of that and watching a whole new team in North Carolina think about it very differently than what the actual premise of the conference is. So that was, it's kind of fun though to see the volunteers. It's very fun actually to see volunteers from the 3 states, different kinds of ways of doing things and thought processes. And we prodded and on this one last year, or for the North Carolina host, we prodded into elevating the topics beyond technical. We were really trying to get folks to think about more policy driven, more just bigger picture kinds of things, and bring in, typically we want to bring in speakers and ideas that we don't see at our normal conferences. We really focus on making this as different as we can, both in format and in the topics, and just even the group that puts it together are a bunch of quirky people, and always thinking about how do we, you know, what are things that we would like to hear if we didn't have to have, you know, rules like we do in our normal conferences. Who are doing weird things that we want to hear about.
So as a good example of that. So this year we have banned PowerPoint at the conference. It's not quite that bad. People can still have graphics and pictures and that sort of thing, but we pretty much have told the speakers, word slides, we're just not going to do those. So, you know, don't bother with the PowerPoint word slides. I will say, I'd say probably on the MOU, the way we fixed the MOU was that the host state is basically going to be totally fiscally responsible for the conference. So whether it's good or bad, the host state takes all and risk all, and it'll be the same when Georgia hosts the next time.
Yeah, we had a little problem last time. We all ended up writing checks. That was difficult.
Yeah.
A spinoff, and we'll probably talk about this more when we get into smaller groups, but a really great spinoff of Confluence in my mind was during the pandemic. We had this Confluence program really pretty well laid out, and we didn't want to lose momentum. One thing, you know, like in most conferences, but particularly in Confluence, it's a smaller group of people, and they do really get very you know, close to each other. There's a lot of socializing in this one, intentionally, a designed socializing, and we didn't want to lose momentum. So we did do a virtual freebie Confluence conference, and that was really, really fun. We brought in a keynote speaker who was a treat for people to hear from, but we still tried to keep that 3-state, something from each state flavor. That was really very interesting. But what I've really appreciated is the relationship that, I'll just say this, David, is, you know, with you and me, and we had with Catrice during the pandemic. We became a support group. We scheduled a weekly call with each other just to say, hey, how are you doing this? How's this going? What ideas do you have about that? I had a lot of personnel challenges at the time, and I used the team of 3 to really help me problem solve. So Confluence is a way to build those kinds of relationships. For me, it became very important.
Yeah, I think that's about all I've got on it. Diane, do you want to open it up for questions, or how do you want to do this?
Yes, that would be absolutely great. If people can unmic, or they can put their comments in chat. But I'm sure there's a lot of interest out here as we're going to be moving together, working with other, especially member associations. There's opportunities available, but to take a look at how you all can come together, like Pam said, it actually became more than just the event. It really broadened all three of your working relationships together, where you could brainstorm and feel very safe that you could ask some of those detailed questions in how you're running your association. So anyone out there have questions? It's a little quiet.
I'll ask a question, and I don't know, yeah, I might have missed it, but how did you handle it during COVID? Is that when you?
Yeah, we did
Yeah.
a virtual event. Yeah.
Yeah.
But we changed the format, and that, we didn't have a full Confluence conference. We had nobody can, we learned pretty quickly, you're going to kill people with these long Zoom meetings. So we had just a quick, I think it was a 2-hour, and we made it free so that anybody could participate. And it was well attended and well planned. That's one thing I'll say about it. It's a fairly complicated conference to plan, but I think if you asked anyone who is involved in it, they would tell you the value of having those planning meetings and chatting with each other and catching up and hearing what's going on really fosters a strong relationship, that just carries on. It's really nice.
Did one of the states get stuck with the bill because you were sharing when it came to since you share in all the profits? Well, no, you don't share in the profits. The host state does.
Yeah. Without trying to throw North Carolina under the bus too bad. When they hosted last year in Asheville, they did not meet their budget. They went over budget significantly. Part of that is Asheville is expensive. Yeah, and it was at Biltmore, so that didn't help. But I don't know, quite frankly, that they were monitoring their committee as robustly as they should have. So they ended up losing money, and according to the existing MOU, we were financial partners, win or lose, and so they ended up sending us a bill, which prompted us to say, okay, well, that's enough of that. The host state will just have to take all the risk or all the profit, and we'll just rotate. And when you host, you get the same, opportunity.
Thank you.
So David and Pam, your event is next week. How are the numbers for the attendance?
Yeah, this conference is about 100-person event most years, and we're closing in on that number pretty rapidly. Not quite there yet, but I think maybe back when the water wars were really rampant, it was more like 120 or 130 or so. Pam, weren't we more up in that neighborhood? But the water wars have sort of been settled, and the South Carolina lawsuit has been settled. So we are talking about each state's water planning efforts. So that's a segment in the program. Every state will update where each state is in the water planning effort. Georgia has been doing water planning now for a decade. South Carolina is in the middle of their planning, and I think North Carolina is sort of still modeling stuff. So they've not actually enacted any rules around, their water planning. So again, the 3 states are in very different places, but that lets us, sort of learn from each other as well.
The numbers are never, this is not a very big conference because it attracts more of the leadership from organizations, and the leaders that go really, really appreciate it. But it is a fairly small, and I would honestly say, maybe David, you would disagree with this, but if you looked at it as a pure business venture, it's a loser. It's, if we cover our costs, that's what our goal is.
Yeah, you're right. This is not a moneymaker for the association. This is one, in fact, we had even discussed, has Confluence outlived its useful life? And there was such a outcry from the membership, like, oh no, you can't do away with that one. This is one of our favorite conferences. So yeah, so it is not a moneymaker. This is more of a service event, I guess. Maybe we could look at it to try to get the states together and talk about stuff.
Right.
So we do have a chat here from Lane McWilliams. Do you have a joint conference planning committee that stays in place over several events, or is every conference planned individually by a new committee each year?
Maybe a little of both. So the host state is probably going to take on the lead responsibility. So right now, the South Carolina team comprises the majority of the planning team, but we have hopefully 2 representatives from each other state. And so it'll be the same when Georgia hosts next time. They'll lead the way, but we'll have a couple of people from each state to be on that planning committee. And they may or may not be the same people.
One of the things that we do with this one is we always have an event before the actual conference starts. And it might be a tour, it might be, something social, but it might not even be water related, but it's really a pre-conference event that we try to get people in there a little bit early. It's the conference itself is just 24 hours. I mean, it's just a half a day one day and half a day the next day, and it's a Thursday, Friday. So it's a quick event, but we do try to build in some interesting options in advance of the conference too. The planning team gets very close and very supportive of one another. And I do think that that's ultimately the biggest value to the volunteers is the relationships and the things that they learn and the way they push each other to think about this conference and the speakers and the format differently. It's a very creative process, and it takes a little while, to kind of shake off all the other things that you usually do and get into a more creative mindset. It's fascinating, really.
Great. And we have one more question here from Jason Lutz. Is there an opportunity to attend these conferences, for example, via Zoom as well as in person, or is it just in person?
Yeah, these are just in person. Again, this is probably more workshop size than, conference. So to try to pull it off virtually as well as in person would be a pretty big lift beyond what we're able to do, I think.
Plus, it's very social. And we really do build in a lot of social breaks. There's a lot of cheese, a lot of wine, a lot of crackers, and that's hard to do virtually. So, yeah.
Well, very good. Thank you so much, Dave and Pam, for sharing the event, and also congratulations as you go into next week in producing a very successful event. So we wish you all the best, and especially to take the time away from your busy schedule to be with us here today. If people have any other questions, just put them in chat and we'll see if we can come back to them later on in the event. So at this time now, let's move on to our second presenter, hosting a partnered virtual paid event with other MAs. We are now going to hear from Scott Lander from New England.
All right. Well, hi, everybody. Everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Hold on. Here we are. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me today. I see so many new faces. I guess one of the, partnering with, of course, with WEF and then recently through the pandemic with the Pacific Northwest, we've made a lot of new friends, and I think it's, partnering is the way to go, especially in all of our organizations, to see what's going on in other parts of the US. So my name's Scott Lander, and I am the NEWIA, which is the New England Water Environment Association, MA, and I'm the Collection Systems Water Resource Council Director. It's my first year on the board, so it's an exciting time for me and learning curve and everything, but it's great to be here. And I just wanted to give a quick shout out. I saw that our NEWIA president is actually viewing this webinar. So Bob, it's great to have you here today. And, we look at partnering and in just the water industry and as a whole, and NEWIA's, Bob came up with One Water is our, is what our featured topic, or just in general, we're looking at one big organization and one water. So Bob, that was a great way to get our year going.
Thank you, Scott. And
You're welcome.
I just got back from DC, where we met with our representatives with New England Water Works, and NEWIA went together, water and wastewater, and met our Vermont delegation together. Thank you.
That's terrific. I'm going to make that trip next year. But thanks, Bob. Thanks for being here. So, the topic today is, planning, developing, and implementing a joint MA webinar. I don't think we had ever done one before as a webinar. We have done in the past. We've had joint MA programs, conferences with NIWIA, the New York organization, and that was in person. So we do that every few years, and we have one coming up this spring for our spring meeting up at Saratoga Springs. But we never had done a virtual webinar with another MA. So it was all new. It was all during COVID, and we all learned quite a bit about using video conferencing, particularly myself, which I was pretty inept at it and still working through it, but we're getting there. But so all of the planning was done with Zoom or Teams with the Pacific Northwest Clean Water Association. So we were all getting a little better at it as the time approached, about 20 months later, to our actual webinar. So to start out, this is all pretty basic, but you get to think through this because you don't have a lot of time. It seems like 20 months is a lot, but it really isn't when we're all doing our jobs, and being parts of our MAs and committees and such. But so the first thing what happened was in relationships, and Amy mentioned relationships, and the way this whole thing came about was one of our past presidents, Jim Barsanti, actually knew Jeff Schmidt, who at the time for the Pacific Northwest Clean Water Association was the collections committee chair, which I was at the time. And he contacted Jim and said, hey, listen, we, because of the COVID thing, we want to keep things moving. And I thought, hey, I think I'll call somebody that I know. And he said, what do you think of this idea? So we met and he's like, Scott, what do you think about infiltration II coast to coast? And we can compare and contrast, ways we handle them and so on. And I thought that was a fantastic idea. We didn't have as many meetings going on because everybody was in lockdown. So that's how we came up with it, really. So whatever committee on the MAs, whether it's collection, stormwater, government affairs, public awareness, whatever, those people, you need to get together as soon as you can to get going. So, like I said, the time frame for my first conversation with Jeff Schmidt was February 21st of 2020, and our webinar was on November 9th. So it was, total time was approximately like 20 months. So, it comes up quick. It seemed like there was a lot of time, but, towards the end, it was kind of crunch time. So the second things we did was, first we developed that topic a little more, massage that a little bit. And then both MAs started to form their subcommittees for the webinar. All right, so we both said, hey, we have to reach out to our committees on collections and start gathering some volunteers. So we thought the best way to do that was to have the committee chairs reach out to all of our committee members and inform them that we were going to have a joint specialty conference. And that was really the beginning of like how we marketed it. So that's really what you're doing. You're starting to market a webinar and garner interest and get volunteers for your subcommittees. So that was really important. And we have a very healthy and active, both of us actually did. So we were very fortunate. We had a lot of strong committee members that were always stepping up. And that really makes a very significant difference when you're doing something like this, particularly for the first time. Next, we started to reach out for speakers that had something to do with the topic and theme being presented. So I would say that was probably one of the hardest things, like figuring out who we wanted, whether they were going to be large agencies, large cities, small cities, DEPs, those type of agencies. So we set out to kind of think through that. Had a lot of discussions about that. So that's definitely an important check mark to get that done. Another important thing was, because typically there's so many different either conferences. At the time there wasn't any in-person conferences, but people were really starting to get into the webinar thing and video conferencing, things like that. So the next thing to do would be, we wanted to check with WEF and also the other MAs around the country to see if, what they had dates scheduled for, so we weren't stepping on each other, because, you do that sometimes and then attendance is a little weaker. So, we went through all that. It took us a few months to really come up with a date, because there were so many other things going on at the time. So that's something you have to consider. So it's very important from the beginning to have your staff for your MA involved right from the beginning. We're fortunate out here at NUIA to have a paid people that run our association, and they are just spectacular at it because we have such a large membership. And so the Pacific Northwest, that was a totally they were in a transition with people. And so they were relying on all volunteers to run their part in the webinar program. So we both discussed it, and speaking with Janice Moran, who's our program manager at NUIA, we felt we had everything in place already. Like we had we were running platforms to do some webinars already, so we had a little bit of experience in that. So we decided that we would take the lead in doing a lot of the actual technical parts for like running the actual webinar. So, you know, and that we had an informal what would you call it, a MOU to get started. It was really a verbal thing. We didn't really do anything in writing. You know, it was the two of us. We were taking the lead on it, and we were really happy to do that. And you know, so it's something to consider when you're going forward. You know, if you want a letter of agreement, so everybody knows what everybody else is doing. So the next thing we did was we wanted to figure out that you would think virtual webinars wouldn't be that expensive, but it was surprisingly, it's not cheap. Let's put it that way. You think it might be, but they aren't. And I can't give you a figure actually of what it was, but we did cover our costs on it. So that was pretty good. So again, this was the time that we talked a lot about people, what responsibilities people, you know, we're going to take, what the registration price would be for attendees. So we wanted to make sure we weren't making it prohibitive, but we didn't want to lose money either, right? So, we both of us decided on a registration fee, which was around $60. It seemed like pretty reasonable, and we ended up with a nice. We were on like 64 to 70 attendees, and I'd say we pretty much broke even on that. It wasn't a moneymaker, but we didn't really lose money on it either. So, oops, let me go back here. So I think I covered this, but so we kind of figured out, because the Pacific Northwest Association was going through a transition and they didn't really have a staff per se. Everything was being, you know, volunteer. That we figured out that we had a little bit stronger support in NUIA than they did. So, and because we were really making this just really a knowledge, you know, a lot knowledge sharing, we weren't really particularly looking to make, you know, revenue above and beyond the cost of the webinar. So the next thing we wanted to review was, are we going to have CEUs? So that's, you know, because people weren't getting out a lot. You know, we had the check with the states. Our state, we don't need to give these CEUs. We didn't have to like put together the program and send it. Like New York State, you have to have the program put together and sent to you know, a particular entity. They look at it and decide if they are going to give CEUs. But that really wasn't the case here. I don't think it was in the Pacific Northwest either, but it definitely is in like Connecticut and New York out here, that that you basically have to have them sign off on the particular program. So we then we needed to decide on, okay, so we have our theme, our topic. We're reaching out to people already for presenters, and now we're deciding on, well, what is how are we going to organize this? Is it just going to be strictly technical sessions? Do we want to have some roundtable discussions, which we've had in the past in person-to-person events? In the end, we decided on mostly technical sessions, but we did have a lot of Q&A during the webinar with some of the presenters, which were agencies. So once we selected the people that we wanted to participate, we asked for all their bios right away, encouraged them to get their presentations put together fairly quickly. I'm sure, as you all are aware from your past experiences, you ask early and they still come in fairly at the last minute because somebody's always tweaking them and so on. So it's like, so we were asking people right away, and so Jeff Schmidt on his end, he was always having some touches like with the presenters saying, hey, just want to see how you're going. It's really important because everybody's busy particularly during COVID. It just changed everything up during the pandemic. So, we would lightly encourage them probably every month just to make sure how things were going. And they would give us some feedback and tell us they were still working on it, or they were halfway done or whatever. But that was something we strongly encouraged to keep in contact with your speakers. So the committee chairs recommend definitely reaching out again to members of your committees to keep them, in the loop, and let them know what the progress is of your planning and putting together the webinar. And again, it's like it's part of the marketing of it, just to reach out to like our committee, our collection systems committee. At the time, we had, I think, 87 members. So we had a very strong membership for our collection systems committee. I was always like sending out little messages here and there, letting them know how things were going, asking if anybody else wanted to volunteer, things like that. But we ended up with a subcommittee that was really vibrant and strong. Again, we kept reaching out to the speakers. I mean, it was a must to continue to do that. Some people ended up being kind of on the fence if they thought they might have to drop out. But most of them hung in there. In the past, we've had people drop out of our regular our face-to-face annual conferences in Boston. But we usually have a very healthy backup for presentations, so for technical sessions. So that's always a good idea to, get as many as you can, rank them like we do, and then have some other strong ones in the back, right there, ready, willing, and able, in case somebody drops out. So because it was virtual, you don't know if people are actually, doing their regular job, talking to people on the phone. Just typically, really, they might sign up and then they want CEUs, but you can't just give it to them. So you had, particularly in states where, they need to know if they were on the whole presentation, the whole webinar. So we came up with poll questions that we would ask throughout the webinar. We had that was one of the technical things. They would pop up on the screen, and they were asked to answer them. So, and they could do it, and then they were tabulated, so they knew that what people were on the whole program, so they could get their CEUs, ECUs, excuse me. So we also, thought, well, a lot of audiences can be kind of quiet. It seems more when you're at an in-person event, people have more of a tendency to raise their hands. But like as we had just experienced earlier when the last speakers were finished, it's like, I don't know, it's just human nature. They might have questions, but not everybody really wants to ask them. So we got together, and just over time, we were getting a lot of input from our committee members and our subcommittees and such on what questions we could ask, given the speakers that were there, that type of thing. Yeah, if they're not hard questions, you want to just make sure that people are clicking on it so that they're actually on the webinar. It's not like you can look out to the audience, so to speak. I mean, I certainly was so focused on what I was doing for the first time doing one of these webinars. I wasn't really thinking like how many people were there. I had no clue until after it was over. So develop those questions for the moderators. So very important, particularly if a lot of people haven't been using Zoom or Teams, or we were using FeedLoop, which was we contracted to run our webinars. And it was so important to go through a dry run first. So a few days before, we made it pretty much mandatory that all speakers and moderators and staff would be on this trial run. So it was just basically to check the sound, screen sharing, which I always, had a problem with them. Seems a little easier to me now that I've done it for probably like 15, 20 times. But we were all engaged in it. We went through, we definitely had, some issues that we worked out during 2 days before the webinar was given. It was figuring out chat rooms. That was all new to pretty much all of us. We didn't even know what a chat room was, so we all learned how to use that a little bit more, because we did have breakout rooms. So we got to figure that out a little bit. So lessons learned. I guess the first one was we did get feedback we did have sponsors, and I think there was probably what we learned was probably a better way to really fulfill what the sponsors were looking for, like the recognition that they were the sponsors. I think we just did it in the beginning, and then we were trying something in the chat rooms too. But frankly, the chat rooms were kind of lean, a little bit lean on people getting into the chat rooms. Again, I think it was just because it's kind of new. When you're not person to person, you kind of still feel like you're outside the loop a little bit. And I think that intimidates some people. So I think we have to work on, as our organization, when we do a webinar again, is to come up with a better way so the sponsors who are just so, we have a lot of great sponsors, we get all the way up to platinum sponsors, and they're just such a major part and drive our organization. So we want to do a better job for them. So start early. Once you decide, yeah, we're going to have a webinar, you don't want a couple months to go by before you actually start doing the work. Particularly when you're trying to get agencies, like DEPs, water districts, large and small agencies, cities and such. You really want to start early, because we were kind of shocked how quickly 20 months went by. This is so fast. And again, back to what Amy was saying, relationships. I mean, this webinar all started because two people had worked together at a civil engineering firm in Massachusetts. I think it was EarthTech, if I'm not mistaken. It was one of those. It ended up being AECOM maybe. But that relationship got the ships, out to the water and into the wind and sailing. And and that's how the whole thing started. So you really want to really utilize your network and friendships, throughout the United States. People, they're so mobile these days. There's people that were members of NUIA, now they're out in the Northwest, and they might have moved to New York, whatever. So remember those people and utilize them, stay in touch with them. Is there any question? See, this is when we'd have a moderator have one, and then they jump in and go, well, Scott, I got a question for you. But, well, if nobody has a question, I thank you very much for listening, and please get a hold of me, Scott Lander at retainit.com. And I'd be happy to talk to anybody in any of the MAs across the country if they want to dig a little deeper to understand how our first webinar went. Thank
Great.
you.
And Scott, we will share your presentation out with everybody. And again, if you have any more questions along the way, just go ahead and put it in chat. And at this time, so we can stay.
Diane, I didn't have a question, but I did have relay something we tried in our virtual events. We actually had commercials, so the vendors could do commercials. So we allowed them, like a 60-second spot, and they were very creative. They filmed their own commercial, because you can do that within Zoom now. You can get on, throw up a couple of PowerPoints, show a video, and we sold essentially commercials during our webinar instead of just showing their logo, and it went over very well.
Well, that's great. I was just thinking that that sounds like a great idea, but it's a revenue generator for sure. The only drawback to that is we have a lot of smaller vendors that can't even afford to do something like that. So they feel like, they're not getting what they deserve. But I personally like the idea. I mean, not everybody can be a $200 million civil engineering firm, or
Yeah,
David,
and
I
that's
like
why
the
we emphasized that they could do something as simple as record their own little Zoom commercial. They could get on. It didn't have to be a television production. They could just get on, talk about their product, show a couple of slides, and that was it.
Okay.
On
Yeah,
Zoom.
so it didn't have to be professionally
No.
coordinated.
Yeah, some of the
Nice.
bigger vendors, they have that stuff, but yeah, most of them were actually sort of homemade Zoom commercials. Yeah.
I see. All right, great. That's a great idea.
Well, great. Thank you again, Scott. We really do appreciate this. And also
My pleasure.
Lane with Pacific Northwest. It's just a great example of the collaboration across the US. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So next, we are going to hear about how Arizona, California, and Nevada have partnered together for a long time. And so, Tom, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Diane. All right, well, hopefully everybody can hear me okay?
Yes.
Just thank you all for taking part of your day to attend this leadership webinar. As Diane mentioned, I'm going to talk about the collaboration from our 3 MAs that ultimately ended up in the creation of a new entity called the Tri-State Seminar LLC. And just a little by way of background, I'm a past president, past WEF delegate from AZ Water, and I currently sit on the board for the Tri-State Seminar LLC. So just briefly, what I want to go over with you today is just going to give a little bit of background on what the Tri-State Seminar is. I'll talk about how the collaboration ended up becoming a separate entity. Then we'll review how it functions, where things stand today, and then finally what some of our future challenges are. So the origin of it, the Tri-State Seminar is currently an annual 3-day conference and exhibition. And the goal of it is to provide affordable and high quality education to water and wastewater professionals throughout the Western US. It was created by and is geared towards operations staff and utility managers. And basically those are the folks that came together, and I'm not sure if they were all attending maybe what at the time was Water Pollution Control Federation annual conference, but they were at an event, and the discussion was, we need to come up with something that where our operators can get additional education and to help them maintain their certifications. So this all happened back in the mid-'80s, and the first conference was held in 1985 in Bullhead City, Arizona. And it was originally called Tri-State Seminar on the River because Bullhead City is situated right there on the Colorado River. I think the first conference maybe had about 50 attendees. So it started fairly small. The next year, it moved upstream to Laughlin, Nevada, again, still on the river. And Laughlin had just more hotels and facilities that could host an event. And they were there for about 20 years, and then eventually outgrew the conference in Laughlin. Towards the end there, it was spread across multiple hotels. The exhibition, the exhibit hall wasn't really a hall, it was outside under tents. And so they decided to move a little bit further north to, it's not listed there, but it's Primm, Nevada, where they could kind of get things back under one roof. Hopefully nobody on the call is from Primm. It's not really the garden spot of the country, but so they were there for a few years, and then eventually made the decision to move to Las Vegas. Just again, it was a factor of growth and finding a facility that could hold the tracks, the educational tracks that it developed, as well as the exhibition. It moved there in 2013, and there was a lot of concern because we were just at that time coming out of the Great Recession. A lot of businesses had actually pulled events from Las Vegas because just, if you're laying people off, you didn't want to be sending people to a conference in Las Vegas. So there was a lot of concern about whether attendance would drop, if utilities would be comfortable with sending their employees to Las Vegas, but it all worked out well, and the growth continued. So the original collaboration was by 4 associations. AZ Water is both AWWA and WEF. We've been that way since we started about 95 years ago. It also included CWEA, Nevada WEA, and originally Cal Nevada AWWA. Cal Nevada left the collaboration in the mid-2000s. We'll just say it was for creative differences. But the proceeded forward with the 3 associations you see here. So I'm not sure back at the start what type of agreement they had, if it was just a memorandum of understanding, but in about, at least from the 1990s, mid 1990s on, they had what was called a mutual participation agreement. The term of the agreement was for 6 years, and it established things like governance, scope of services, the legal relationship, insurance. There was also a code of conduct in there. And basically how everybody worked together. It wasn't considered a partnership arrangement, but there was an equal division of expenses and revenue. The interesting thing about the MPA was that it required one association to serve as fiscal sponsor, and I think for 2 agreement terms, so over a period of 12 years, that fiscal sponsor was CWEA. And basically what they did was they provided their tax ID number, they conducted the audit, they did any tax preparation that was required. It was their insurance that covered the event. And they were a signatory on all like bank accounts, and they were the signers for execution of contracts. So the event was governed by an executive committee. It basically was a 12-member board with 4 members from each association. It was led by the officer group of a chair, vice chair, secretary, and treasurer. And so if you wanted to move through the chairs, you started as secretary, then went to vice chair, then chair, and treasurer was just one of the officer positions, but it wasn't a moving through the executive positions. So each of those positions was a 2-year term, and it rotated between each association. So for 2 years, the chair was from California. Then for 2 years, the chair was from Nevada, and then 2 years, the chair was from Arizona. And the treasurer, whichever association was chair that year, the treasurer had to come from one of the other 2 associations. And that had to do with just the signatory, who could sign checks and that type of thing. So the executive committee met quarterly, mainly to basically work out the details of the conference each year, and do the planning and execution. A quorum for the committee was considered 7 members, and there had to be at least 1 member from the 3 associations. And at the time, it was if the board member couldn't attend, you could assign your vote to maybe somebody else from your association that was attending the board meeting. So basically what we had an executive committee that was consisted of volunteers, and a lot of whom were long-term volunteers, and some of them that had been there from the inception of the idea of this conference. And then you had leadership from each of the associations, and it kind of had some there were some difficulties with that, in that you had this committed group of volunteers that felt this event was theirs, and then you had association leadership that maybe came in, like from Arizona, whoever was president that particular year, that you were also on the board of Tri-State. And so there was a lot of, you had people that you maybe weren't as committed, but yet they were still making some decisions. And so it got to be, there was some frustration that was developing with how the things were running. So how we moved from just like a mutual participation agreement. I don't know why I can't say that, but from an MPA to forming a separate entity. The MPA was expiring in December of 2015, and a new agreement was needed. There were some concerns being expressed by CWEA, who was the fiscal sponsor, about costs they were incurring to manage it, and use their staff to do things like, contract negotiation, the financial parts of it. And the other concern was that due to the size that the event had grown to. Just fiscal liability to each association if something happened that each association was at risk for essentially payment of damages if a claim were to be made. So in the summer of 2015, we had a contract evaluation team that consisted of the president and president-elect of each association. And so that 6-member group then started the process of looking at what's the best way to proceed forward. Basically, we let the executive committee of Tri-State deal with planning the event, and the leadership of the associations would deal with coming up with a new agreement. So to help assist us with this process, we got a legal firm called Venable LLP out of Washington, D.C. They were experienced with different types of contract formats and working with nonprofit organizations. So what we found out going through this was that our MPA functioned more like a contractual joint venture, in that we were all equal participants. We all had fairly equal liability, and claims could be pursued against each entity. Even though we had a fiscal sponsor under the terms of that agreement, it wasn't a true fiscal sponsor agreement. So we looked at a fiscal sponsor model, and under that, the sponsor would hold the ownership and the risk. And other entities, for example, if California was the fiscal sponsor, Nevada and Arizona would be then execute sub agreements. And what that would end up is that California would basically be running the event with assistance from us. They would be making the majority of the decisions. We'd no longer likely have an even split of revenues from the event. That wasn't really what anybody on the executive committee was wanted to do. They had kind of all grown up together, and they wanted to keep it more of a partnership type arrangement. So we ended up looking at a limited liability company model, or an LLC. That basically, again, is creating a separate entity. It reduces the liability to the member associations because the entity itself has the fiscal responsibility, and it allowed for equal governance and cost and profit sharing. The only disadvantage, or the main disadvantage to it, was it required a lot more paperwork and startup activities to actually create a company. So we had, so it took about 1.5 years. We had so the formation steps involved, we had determined the name of the entity. So it had been called, up until this time, Tri-State Seminar on the River. We decided, since we were probably going to be in Las Vegas for a while, we just dropped the on the river part and went with Tri-State Seminar LLC. We had to file a certificate of formation. A lot of LLCs are created or housed in Delaware. So that's where the LLC is housed, or the paperwork is housed. We had to determine a governance structure for how the company was going to be run. And then we also had to come up with a new operating agreement. And so as far as the operating agreement went, there were a number of elements that were taken from the existing MPA, but then there were other elements that had to be developed in terms of, okay, if the member wants to leave, if one of the member associations wants to leave, or if they want to, can you add another member at some point? And just a lot of more procedures on financials, how that all operated. So that all went into creating the operating agreement. And so again, we started the process in September or in summer of 2015. We had presentations made from our group to the executive committee to get their buy-in into what we were doing and what was going into the agreement. And then each of the three member associations, the boards for those associations had to approve the operating agreement. And so that all happened by December of 2016. And so the LLC was actually born on January 1st, 2017. And so we created a new logo. We have a web page. We had, of course, our own letterhead for correspondence. We had our own, bank accounts, that type of thing. So as far as how the LLC operates, each MA is an owning member of the LLC, but as a separate entity, they have no. They don't have a say in how the LLC is operated. And that's one of the things in order to minimize your liability is if you create an LLC, you have to treat it as a separate entity. So the members basically are limited to appointing the managers on the board. So each MA has 5 managers. We have a 15-person board. Again, we have quarterly board meetings that help with the planning of the event and the execution. A quorum is 9 managers with a minimum of 3 from each member. And we maintain the same officer positions that we had under the MPA, and as well as the same 2-year rotation schedule for leadership of the LLC. So as our own company, we had to have our own tax ID. We're responsible for getting an audit of our finances. We then issue a K-1 document to each of our members for their use in filing their own tax documents. The LLC provides monthly reporting to each member in terms of financial reports, as well as quarterly and then an annual financial summary. We also procure our own insurance. We have general liability, directors and officers insurance, and event cancellation insurance. That's written in those were all insurance requirements that are included in the operating agreement. So the LLC itself it's a 100% volunteer organization. We have about 120 volunteers that basically do all the work that's required to put on this event. There's 7 different committees. Local arrangements that are listed here. Local arrangements basically is responsible for working with the venue, the hotel, regarding what our needs are for rooms, for whatever kind of refreshments or whatever type of AV systems that we need, as well as advanced planning in terms of looking ahead and negotiating either renewal contracts to stay at the venue or getting proposals from other venues in the Las Vegas area in case we wanted to move the event to a different place. There's also a registration committee that handles all the advance signups for the event as well as day of registration. Program committee has a lot of people. There's a chair and co-chair for all of the different technical tracks that we have. And then the program committee is also responsible for the continuing education certificates. We issue professional development hours for each hour of the technical session that someone attends. We have an exhibit hall committee, and they're responsible for working with the exhibitors, laying out the hall, working with the venue to make sure of move-in requirements, location, spacing, that type of thing. A communication committee handles the pre and post conference publications. There's a conference app, and there's also there's something else that I can't think of right at the moment, but there's also a risk management committee that's responsible for procuring the insurance, as well as developing the policies and procedures to guide the LLC. And then there's a volunteer coordination committee that's responsible for figuring out where volunteers can be used as people sign up to volunteer. And they also help with we have an awards group that also presents awards at the end of the conference. We do have contract services that we use. There's an audit firm, a tax preparation firm, legal services. I mentioned the post and or the pre and post conference publications. Those are done for us by Kelman. And then this year we are adding a bookkeeper to our list of contract services to help our treasurer to keep from keeping the books becoming a full-time position. So where are we today? Basically, the program format is 3 days of technical sessions. Each technical session is a 50-minute session, and there are 7 sessions per track per day. By attending the 50-minute session, that earns the attendee one professional development hour. The sessions run from 7:30 in the morning to 3:30 in the afternoon. One of the things we do is we develop the program in the April timeframe. We send that out to the state certification agencies to make sure that they give approval that if someone attends a particular session, that they will receive a PDH credit for that. And so every session that's approved is designated, in the program that it has been approved by your state agency for a PDH. Some other activities that we have as part of the conference, there's a Monday evening social event. There's a golf tournament on Tuesday. We have workshops that are going on concurrently throughout the week. In addition to the technical sessions, those are separate costs that are and separate events that are put on by different organizations. So some of the things we've had have been NASCO training, safety training, MS4 compliance. There's also some operator exam prep that goes on as well as part of the workshops. We also offer educational tours. Some of them are shown there. And then we've also started doing a luncheon for YPs or emerging professionals in an effort to try to get interest with the younger folks in our profession to become interested in volunteering and actually helping to eventually lead the LLC in coming years. The exhibition hall occurs over a 2-day period on Tuesday and Wednesday. It operates from 3:30 to 7. So there's no overlap between technical sessions and exhibit hall. It's basically people go to class in the morning and early afternoon, and then there's just committed exhibit time for about 3 hours after the technical sessions. We have over 470 booth spaces with over 200 exhibitors. And then we've also started incorporating some elements of the operator challenge competition into the exhibit hall. And the photo up above is from the first one that we had in 2019. That's a team from Arizona as well as one from Los Angeles. So again, our continuing goal is to provide affordable, high quality education. The registration cost for the 3 days is just $99. The attendees can earn up to 21 PDHs, and we currently offer 15 different program tracks over the 3-day period. Those are the topics, those are the type of tracks that we provide. The numbers that you see off to the side are the number of days that those particular tracks are offered. So for example, backflow prevention is only offered one day out of the 3. Other ones that are typically more popular, like wastewater collections or water distribution, those have full tracks every day of the 3 days of the seminar. So one of the perks of being the chair of the LLC is you get to pick the conference theme. We've had some pretty good ones over the last few years. In 2017, it was a salute to service. As part of that event, we honored the attendees who also were military veterans. That was followed up in 2018 with kind of a Hawaiian themed event. In 2019, we did it's called the Day of the Operator theme, which was kind of a takeoff on the Southwest heritage of Day of the Dead. And sometimes the themes lend exhibitors get in on the act, and they develop special things. This was a specialty fire hydrant that was done for the event that was actually auctioned off as part of the exhibit hall events. Unfortunately, in 2020, we didn't have an event because of COVID. But just like the Empire and Star Wars, the Tri-State Seminar came back in 2021. And we had a few characters attend that year. That 2021 was we had a lot of discussion about whether we were going to move forward with an in-person event, and we were worried about how much attendance we would have. Would people be reluctant to attend? Fortunately, the hotel worked with us and basically said they just wanted people back at the venue, and so they waived all our contractual requirements for a number of room nights and that type of thing. But even with that, our attendance was about 90% of what the 2019 attendance was. So a lot of people decided to come or ended up coming back for the event. And then last year we had a golf related theme, keeping water on par. So for last year's event, we exceeded our pre-pandemic attendance. We had over 3,800 participants. Of that, about 2/3 of that was actual technical session attendees, just about 860 exhibitor personnel. Our exhibit booth space goes very quickly. It generally sells out in less than an hour, and we have a fairly extensive waiting list. And then we also have over 31 event sponsors that help with the financial aspects of the event. So just briefly, some of our future challenges. One of the things we want to continue to do is be operator-led and operator-focused. On the board of managers, probably 2/3 of the board are actually utility staff level people or utility managers. There's a couple of road consultants that get to sit in. We have a couple of exhibitors that get to participate on the board, but the majority are operations type folks. So some of the challenges that we have are just venue limitations. Are as we get more and more people that attend, can the current venue where we are, can that handle additional attendees? We're already at the limit from exhibit hall standpoint, but we have a very good deal. We've been at this particular venue, the South Point Hotel and Casino, for this will be our 11th year, and we have a very, very good relationship with them. The other thing that we kind of have to decide is what size event is sustainable with an all volunteer group. How big do we want to get? And is it, there's, I think, a limit to what the quality of a program you can put on if you're strictly doing it all with volunteers. And then we also want to try to maintain affordability. We can probably move to other locations, but it would impact our ability to keep our registration rates low and affordable. We get a lot of attendees that come from smaller communities that don't have a lot of budgets for education, and so having that lower price really is something that we want to maintain. And then the biggest challenge I think everybody has is just finding the next generation of dedicated volunteers. The picture up here at the top, that's the group of people from Arizona that a lot of them were actually involved in the inception of the event. And some of those folks aren't with us anymore. And so we're trying to recruit younger professionals, emerging professionals, to get them excited. This event and the people that volunteer for it, it's become basically almost like a big family. And we have people that volunteer whose their parents actually were part of the original core, and their children now, their sons and daughters are actually helping to keep and sustain this event moving forward. So with that, that's all I have. And just like to invite, if you're going to be out west here in August of this year, hopefully you can attend our 38th annual seminar. The theme this year is weird science, because if you work with water, it's kind of weird science. So anyway, my contact information is there on the bottom. And I have one more slide that's our legal as part of AZ Water. These are my opinions. They're not AZ Water's opinions. So anyway, that's all I've got. And Diane, I'll turn it back to you for if anyone has any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Tom. What a great legacy here with the amount of years, 38 years, and just providing us a picture of the journey that your organizations have taken. We really do appreciate that. Any questions for Tom right now? Okay. Well,
Actually, I do have something I just would suggest, because I think we're all going through it in the industry of like bringing up younger people to fill positions, especially in like wastewater. So we came up with we have a YP committee, a Young Professionals Committee. It's actually a pretty healthy committee. I think they're at the annual conference this year, they had 120 people at the meeting. So I would encourage maybe to come up with something like that. And then the other thing we do to encourage that, more involvement in our association, we have a poster board it's a competition, and we have students from the universities that that might be part of their getting another degree. And they come in and they bring in their things that they've been working on to do with the water industry in general, our environment. And that's another good way to try to encourage people when they're actually still in school. And we have like a huge participation in that at our annual conference in Boston. I mean, I think we had to limit it, but I think we had like about 15 to 20 like young people that were in sciences, and they came and they had their poster board, and they'd have to explain everything about it. And then eventually, they get a job with either a consulting firm or in another, like a water company, like Watts Water or something like that. And then they end up joining. So this is a couple of ideas that, might help drive getting some younger professionals into the association. Thanks.
And hi, this is Bob Fisher, the NUIA president. Also like to mention, excellent work, Scott. The Poo and Brews, those have been very successful. They've been doing it for years.
That's right.
Now.
Thank you for mentioning
why don't you
that.
why don't you mention that? Because I don't have the best connection.
Yeah, so I don't know, that's probably like 4 or 5 times a year. The Young Professional Committee puts together Poo and Brews, and they usually, I think they may even have a speaker, but it's a good way to get together. They have some beer and they discuss the future, the industry, and and then they bring in more members. So yeah, thanks, Bob. That's a good one. I'm glad you mentioned that one. It's pretty strong. They had good turnout at those too.
Oh, great. All good stuff going on out there for sure. As we move on here, unfortunately, we do not have time to do the breakouts today because we have really learned an awful lot. And again, I'm going to remind everybody, the PowerPoints will be shared, and also the notes from South Carolina and Georgia's talk. We had WEF staff taking detailed notes on that. And also the recording will be shared with everybody too. At this time, I'd like to move forward because I think this gives all of us an opportunity to ask some questions. We have WEF Counsel Barbara Dunn with us today. Barbara will share resourceful information from the legal side to help us avoid some of those risks that we talked about today and build on the clarity of the roles and responsibilities of all those that are involved in this collaboration. So right now, I would like to turn it over to Barbara.
Thank you so much, Diane. A good day, everyone. It's really nice to be with you, and I'm very fortunate to get to catch the tail end of Tom's program and the questions that you have. And I was really excited about the topic because as a lawyer practicing, representing not-for-profit corporations, I do the full range of legal work. But this particular topic, the topic of coming together of nonprofits for various activities, shows, publications, et cetera, it is really one that isn't talked about enough. So I was excited to see how you had themed it and some of these topics, because again, these are things that cross my desk every day. But you know, typically, as you might expect from the legal side, a lot of times when it crosses my desk, it's already a problem. So the goal, of course, is to be proactive rather than reactive. And so I know you've shared with one another today and always, you know, the different ways that organizations could work together. I think the example, a very detailed example that Tom shared was extremely helpful, because I would say that, you know, there's one end of the spectrum that is that the parties coming together do so in a very formal way. And as large as that show has gotten, that event has become, the things that are at stake from a contractual standpoint, from a risk management standpoint, as Tom mentioned, are high. And certainly there's a lot of benefit to creating a formal structure. On the other end of the spectrum is an informal structure. And often that's the case when groups might be just, no pun here, testing the water with a particular activity or a particular new entity. And so it's unclear whether that relationship is going to be sustainable, whether the event will be sustainable. So there's a bit of a trial aspect to it. But I do think, and as we talked about, some of these key themes in the relationship coming together, whether it's an informal way or a formal way, there are definitely key items and aspects to consider. And so I'm going to share some of those with you today. I'll start, I'll say, by a little war story that I'm dealing with right now with one of my clients that had informally, without an agreement, been co-hosting a conference with another entity for the last several years. And it became clear that they wanted to part ways. Unfortunately, they had signed contracts, very large contracts with hotels for meetings in the future, without having any contract. So, you know, it's, as you can kind of expect where the story is coming now. We have a hotel saying, you know, our client is joint and severally, right, equally liable on a hotel contract. And then we have the other side saying, we're not going to let you out of this contract unless you pay us double. You know, it's just this crazy situation. And I know it's frustrating for the staff, my client, and the volunteers that have put this together. And so, you know, to me, what that illustrates is that it would benefit both parties to have something in writing. It's difficult now to go back and say, well, what did termination say? Or what does a contract say about contracts that were entered into with the prospect that we were going to have, you know, be together and work together in the coming years. So it's an example of something gone wrong, and hopefully that isn't something that will happen to any of you. But if you are thinking, oh, we've always done it this way, we don't need an agreement, I would definitely, you know, say pause and think about that a little bit more, because even the simplest, and, you know, folks always ask, should we call it a memorandum of understanding or an agreement? Honestly, it doesn't matter what you call the document, as long as it's something in writing and it's signed by the parties, you know, that to be bound. That's what you're really looking for. And that format is important. So, you know, both organizations, not only their financial resources at stake, but your reputations are at stake. And so it behooves both organizations, or however many you have coming together, to really make that clear. So let me walk through some key aspects of the relationship. And these would be the case whether we're coming together formally, informally. There's some nuances, and Tom, thank you again, did a great job kind of laying those out for the formal entity. So first, I would say responsibilities of each party. Certainly what I find in my practice is that sometimes you have a circumstance, the example given, for example, one party would serve as a fiscal agent. So sometimes there's a circumstance where one party is going to be the laboring oar. It's going to do a lot of the work, or it's going to commit staff time, things like that. But then there are other instances where the parties kind of come to the table equally. They share responsibilities. Bottom line, try to be as detailed as you can about the responsibilities. I think it's certainly important. We don't want anything to slip through the cracks. And I think having a detailed sort of breakdown of what those responsibilities are, I think a good way to do that, depending on the activity you're doing, is to maybe put that in buckets, who's responsible registration, or managing the conference, or marketing, finance, et cetera. So I think it's a good way to think about the relationship. But again, most importantly, define the responsibilities of each party. And the related point on that is how are, the budget, the finances, because often in identifying the activities, we talk about having to approve budgets ahead of any given project or event. And, what I find on this front is that you have situations where the expectations of the parties are different. One party comes to the table, they think they're going to get all of their internal expenses covered and then, shared, and then they're going to, also maybe share on the joint costs. And other parties say, well, no, I know I need to pay for my own staff, but then we have these joint expenses, joint marketing type expenses. It's critically important to be clear on that point. I have a number of organizations. I have, one great success story of a client that's operated in an unincorporated joint venture manner. An example Tom mentioned about the parties having this contractual kind of the position that they were in with the MPA. And in that way, really been very clear about allocations of staff time. And they have successfully navigated allowing some allocation for staff, overhead, et cetera. But again, it's something that you'll want to be very clear about what is or isn't included. And importantly, certainly as it comes to the finances from the activity, if it's a conference or a publication, how is that going to be allocated? What if there's a profit? What if there's a loss? Many groups found that out the hard way. That is when they couldn't have events, certainly. And, we're coming hopefully out of that and having very successful events. But that reconciliation, that allocation, expenses, et cetera, is just critically important. And, I think the related point is that in a lot of instances, what I find is when organizations come together for an event, in a lot of cases, that organization might be doing its own individual events at the same time or around the same time. So you have to, again, allocate between the particular types of activities and the rest. So, I can't say enough about finances, allocation. Are we talking gross revenue? Are we talking net revenue? If it's net revenue, what's coming out of the total before we do an allocation? What about sponsorships, sponsor sales? How are we sharing in those? Again, certainly we could talk a little bit more about particulars, but, when it comes down to it, no surprise to any of you, money is the root of the majority of these disputes. The term of the contract, the term of the relationship is important. I would say if you're coming together for a new activity or a new event, I think the term should reflect that. I think the shorter term, the better. Have the ability to renew a contract, but not a requirement to renew. Allow the parties enough time to test the concept, to work together, and then go from there. The more tested relationships, the tried and true, my client with the unincorporated joint venture going on close to 30 years now, They have contracts that are in the 5-6 year range of a term. Now, there's always going to be the right to terminate. And that is really important. I mean, just as any relationship the organizations enter into, we hope for the best, we plan for the worst. So, what if we just decide it's not working out and it's now the party isn't doing what they're supposed to, we just decide it's not working out. What's our lead time in terms of giving notice if that we want to walk away? What happens if one party isn't fulfilling those responsibilities? We talk about breach and what that looks like and an opportunity to cure it or to fix it. And so termination is equally as important to the term. And again, what I would say is I think your term should reflect the relationship. Sometimes you may have a longer term, but you have more ability or flexibility to terminate the contract, as opposed to some situations where the term might be shorter, but maybe you can only terminate the contract due to breach. And so again, this is something I would want to think about ahead of that relationship, and it does become important. Intellectual property, the example Tom gave about the name, the logo, the website, all of that, certainly when it comes down to it, ownership is important, especially if the parties part ways. Who, if anybody, has the right to use that name thereafter? So it's something to consider. Again, lots that go into it. Similarly, all of the content that comes in all those sessions that come out of the meetings, recordings, content, etc., if you are to market those, who owns that work product? What agreement do you have with the speaker or the contributors about ownership and the rest? That is particularly important. And here again, I find sometimes that organizations come to the table with an expectation that the intellectual property coming out of a joint activity is theirs, and not thinking about the fact that the parties together might be creating new work. Maybe you have volunteers creating the work. Are we clear that the volunteer, that the organization owns the work? We'll get into copyright issues and the rest. So just lots to think about on intellectual property. Definitely want to focus on that. Data, key, critical. If you're going to come together in a joint activity, whatever that activity is, we're going to want to do some marketing, and that requires the parties to exchange data, to share data that is existing data, and then the data that comes out of the activity, the data of the 3,800, I think it was a number, Tom, that came to that conference, which is an amazing number, by the way. Who owns that data? And what rights do the parties have to use that data going forward? Again, I find a lot of times there's this assumption going in that everybody has the right to use. And of course, I'm always asking, well, the person, right? Because nowadays we know, especially those, on the West, and laws like the California Privacy Act and other state laws, it's critically important. My question always is, what did the person who gave their data say? You registered for that conference or event. Did you say they could share your data? That type of thing. So again, I can't say enough about data ownership. I think that's important as well. Similarly, something to consider is whether the parties can engage in so-called competitive activities. In other words, are the parties going to be restricted from similar relationships with shows or events or publications that are competitive to this particular show? There's a concern that it might dilute something if, we come together, so, whether this is an exclusive arrangement or whether we agree that aside from each of our own conferences or webinars, we're not going to come together with another organization to host a annual trade show, whatever restrictions you might have. I put that out there for consideration. It's not applicable in every situation, but I do think it's important. And here again, the parties say, well, there's nothing in this agreement to restrict me from doing that. And again, not having a good, leverage point or something to point to in the contract, the parties can be at a disadvantage. So again, I, encourage you to think about that issue or talk about that issue. Mention the example, the situation I'm dealing with right now, which is contracts. So, when you certainly come together, you execute contracts for services, for venues, all the related activities. When you've come together in the form of a new entity, such as an LLC, Tom's example, you would enter into contracts in that new entity name, which is important. You're going to act as the corporation that's going to protect the liability. When you don't have that structure, what typically happens is one party would take the lead and enter into a contract for the benefit of other parties, or as is the case that I have with my client right now, two parties come together to enter into the contract. Now one party wants to leave, and the venue is saying each party is 100% liable under that contract. So it's important to really be careful about contracts and what liability you're assuming, but also thinking about it. If you're contracting for a venue several years ahead, maybe it's even farther out than the term of the contract, and you decide to part ways, who owns that contract? Is that automatically going to be owned by someone to use? Is it going to go away? All the things, related to that point. So I would, want to make sure we're addressing the issue of what's best to enter into contracts. And again, there are different ways that could be done. That leads to liability issues. And, the two I words here, insurance and indemnification. In the example of Tom's, example with the entities, you actually have the new entity itself can have that insurance, which is a great strategy. When you don't have that entity, you're looking at each entity coming together, their own insurance. And maybe they're looking at improving or enhancing their insurance portfolio to account for a particular activity, maybe even getting special event insurance and the like. And those would be costs, those might be costs that the parties agree up front would be built into the budget, the costs that might be shared or allocated. But it's important to understand what those expectations are. And then the other I word is indemnification. We each come together, we each might do something messing up and get the other party sued. And so indemnification, that concept of hold harmless, held harmless, really important in any contract. But in this joint coming together, it's particularly important. Certainly when you enter into contracts for services, for venues and the like, you'll want both parties to be indemnified. So sometimes what I see is that they'll enter into a service contract and it'll say, one party's indemnified. Well, we got to bring the other party along too, or however many parties are involved to make sure they're protected as well from that vendor. So thinking about risk management in that way is important as well. Confidentiality kind of goes back to the data and IP, but confidentiality of the information that's shared with one another. There's information that's shared at the beginning, there's information that's shared along the way. This could be confidential financial information. This could be a strategy information, right? The so-called secret sauce recipe. It is important to understand what the obligations are and also make clear to volunteers or staff working on the project what their obligations are relative to not disclosing information and the like. So, it's really important. And, lots we could talk about here. One last point, and I know get some questions popping in, would be, and Tom mentioned this briefly, about the potential of adding new entities to the relationship. And, there's in the formal structure of an LLC, you could agree up front what that looks like. But even in an informal relationship, again, my client with the 30-year unincorporated joint venture, they agree that, what's the process if they want to bring a new entity on to be an affiliate of the event or sponsor of the event? What does that look like? What's that approval process look like? And certainly when you get into a situation where one party is going to start sharing in expenses and revenue, then, you're talking about probably modifying the existing relationship and the like. And so I think the scalability potential that you might want to add people, or people go away. You know, and I have entities where, you know, someone wants out. And so we look at what that looks like and understand, you know, what, if any, liability is there. So, you know, lots to talk about here. I think all of these concepts are important to consider. Not, you know, every relationship is going to have something there. Just a final point, I would say, from a tax standpoint, I mean, we talked a little bit about not, you know, we use the term partnership, but partnership, capital P, defined, you know, the IRS likes to call it, is really a true legal and tax partnership. That's not what we're creating. We're creating revenue. The revenue that you're all creating, as long as it's related to your exempt activities, education, trade shows, that's program revenue coming in, that's exempt from tax. Again, you might have advertising, that might be unrelated business income. Again, whole other topic there, but something to think about there. And then again, the liability issues, you know, is it better to put a corporate layer in there to protect the organizations, but understanding there's time and investment in the structure and ongoing. And so is this going to be an activity that's going to be around for a while? So Diane, I know there's lots to talk about. I hope we get some good questions, and I know
Sure.
we could be running into our time allotment too.
Right. Does anybody have any questions for Barbara?
I got a question. So when we have presentations, technical sessions, we always ask in writing, we ask the question in writing, if we can use the material that was presented, and for like publication in our journal. We have a journal that's 4 times a year. We've never had any issues, I don't think, but is that enough to cover like the intellectual property from the presenter if they give us the thumbs up, okay, in writing, that they can, or does it have to be in writing, or can they just say verbally, yes, you can use it?
Yeah, great. It's a great question, and I think you hit the nail on the head, because the analysis, the answer to the question starts with who created the content. You know, if it's the speaker that created the content, they own the right to that content. And so there's 2 ways that your organization could use it. Either you own it, or you have license, a permission, fancy word, to use it. And so most speakers aren't going to give you ownership in the product, because they're going to go down the street and do that same program.
Right.
But they'll give you a license permission. And so it's kind of silly to say this, but it kind of, you think about like a permission slip, it says what you can do with it. Your goal as an organization is to get a permission slip that's really broad, right? That your organization could use it, that maybe affiliated organizations could use it. You could use it in, you know, on the website, you could use it in your journal, you mentioned, and often the catch-all, any other exempt activity of our, you know, your organizations. So when you go for permission, I would always tell clients, go for a very broad scope of permission, even though you think right now, you know, it might be just one thing. But having that in writing, having an agreement is really the best strategy. You know, if you're now going back from a conference a couple of years ago and asking, hey, Barbara, can we put, you know, that content in the journal? I don't have a problem going back and, you know, we have an email trail or something, and, you know, you say, I said yes. I mean, that happens a lot. But I would say on the front end, really good strategy. And look, this can be in a speaker agreement that's just a confirmation letter. You know, dear Barbara, this will confirm you're speaking this day, this topic, and oh, by the way. And so that can also, that permission slip can also cover recording of the session, photographs of the session, use of the collateral, right, the handouts, etc. So all of that is a really good strategy, because when you get that permission slip, then you know what you can do with it. You can, you know, the partner organizations might say, oh, we want to use it in our publication. You're like, did the speaker say we could? So, you know, I think that's a great strategy when you can do it. But if you have stuff that you haven't done that for, at a minimum, I would find a good way to approach the folks and get permission up front when you can. Because
Okay.
it's a lot easier than, trying to get it later on.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. Anyone else? Okay, it's awful quiet. I know that we've passed our 4 o'clock time frame, but we thought we'd give you just one more opportunity if y'all can stay on to ask Barbara any questions.
Diane, I saw in the chat a question about some template documents, and I'm happy to share with the group some of the bullet points that we mentioned today on the joint side, and also with regard to the speaker agreement, to the
Yeah.
extent some of you might be looking for that permission slip. I'll share some samples there.
Oh, that'd be great.
And yeah, absolutely. I mean, and certainly as you might think of other resources, I'm happy to be an ongoing resource for, WAF and for the good work that you all do on the membership association side.
Thank you.
Great, that would be great. All right, well, I want to thank everybody for having attended this with us today. We hope that you found it very information. Thank you to all the speakers. What a wonderful, successful stories that you all are having and shared with us. And we want to continue that collaboration. Just coming off of WEFMAX in St. Louis, we also talked about the collaboration and partnering with other MAs. So I will share some of those notes from the WEFMAX with all of you. And until our next leadership series, we thank you for being with us here today. And thank you, Barbara. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Diane.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
See you. Take care, everyone.